Good afternoon. Welcome to today's SCA webinar with Bob Barbet on Refrac Candidate Selection, Execution, and Performance Evaluation. Before we start today's webinar, we'd like to ask a few questions about the demographics of the audience. So I'm going to launch some polling questions to find out who you are. So what's your primary discipline? We have some votes coming in. We've got some petroleum engineers. Looks like the majority are petroleum engineers. Most of you have voted. So I'll go ahead and close and share the results. 88% are petroleum engineers, 13% other. So the next polling question is, how many years of full-time experience do you have? So we're distributing it. Looks like we're getting in some votes now. Quite a few in the 1 to 10 year range, but also some with more than 20 years. Again, most of you have voted, so I'll go ahead and close this and share the results. Looks like 50% are in the 1 to 10 year range, and then pretty evenly split between the 11 to 20 years and the 21 to 30 years. Okay, so now we have an additional polling question. So let me launch this. So if you're an operator, what is your company doing to protect your primary or parent walls from fracture-driven interactions, or FRAC hits? We're getting some votes here. It looks like most of you are split between, well, no, we're getting more votes on refracs. People are voting a little slower on these. You may have to think about these questions. So far, we don't have anyone who's put in full volume preload. That's where you might have 100% of your total produced fluid, both oil and water. Over half of you have voted, so again, we're getting a good split between less than a full volume preload and refracs. So I'll go ahead and close this one and share the results. 2/3 of you have used less than a full volume of a preload. So let's go through to the next polling question. Does your company have an active refrac program? So this may be a little bit easier. It's either yes or no. The votes are coming in much faster this time. It looks like most of you are in the no category. So most of your companies do not have an active refrac program. We're still getting a few votes, but I will go ahead and close it and share the results so far. 2/3 of you were in the no category for that particular question. Your company doesn't have an active refrac program. So the next question, is your company considering increasing well spacing due to adverse fracture-driven interactions, otherwise known as FRAC hits? Again, this is a yes or no question, so should be pretty easy. And it looks like we're pretty evenly split. So most of the votes have come in at this point. We still have some people thinking about this one. I'll go ahead and close it. We've got most of the votes in and sharing the results. 2/3 of, or I'd say 57%, just over half of you are in the no answer to that question. You're not considering increasing well spacing due to frac hits. But over 40% of you are. And then our last question, what form of diversion is your company using for refracs? We have a choice between expandable liners, cemented liners, individual perf diversion, using PLA, ball sealers, or fiber cat toys. And almost everyone is in that individual perf diversion that has voted so far. We don't have all the votes yet, but it looks like it's unanimous so far with those of you who have voted. You've chosen individual perf diversion. So I'm going to go ahead and close that one, share the results. And of those who voted, 60% of our audience voted on that last one, but all of you who voted were using individual perf diversions. So I am going to go into some brief introductory remarks here before I hand over the presentation rights to Bob Barbet. You're on the webinar today on Refrac Candidate Selection, Execution, and Performance Evaluation. Bob is a well-known figure in oil and gas. He started his career with Schlumberger and has been involved in providing consulting for several decades to more than 200 companies in the realm of petrophysics and completion optimization. He's been an SP Distinguished Lecturer. He's won awards from SPE, and he's well known for providing best practices on fracking and refracking. So Bob has a BS from the U.S. Naval Academy and an MBA from the University of Florida. Bob also teaches a class for SCA that's next offered in August 19th through 20th in Houston, also called Refrac Candidate Selection, Execution, and Performance Evaluation. So if you'd like to sign up for that class, feel free to contact us. We can also offer that class in-house for those of you who might be interested in hosting it. So I'm going to give the presenting rights to Bob, and let's see if I've got the right one here. Bob, if you could share we can see your screen. Thanks, Bob. Please take it away.
Got it? All right.
Yes.
Can you all see me okay? Am I coming through okay?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Good day, because different hours where everybody is. Let's talk a little bit about this course that Susan just mentioned we've got coming up in August. Quite a lot of interest in this right now. There's been a lot of interest in parent-child interactions. We just had a 3-day conference in LA that last month where it's all they talked about. So we've got whole conferences on this stuff now, and there's a lot of anxiety in the industry about this right now. So hopefully this is something that's going to help, find a way to get a better result out of your DSUs. Who should attend? Engineers, managers, geoscientists who want to maximize probability of success from a refrac program. And we talk about both conventional and unconventional. It's the full material. We probably won't cover as much unconventional though this time, because it seems like most of the interest right now is on the unconventional refracs, horizontal multi-stage. But we do cover a lot of material and present a lot of, if you're going to do a vertical refracs, we present all the material you need to know on how to optimize that as well. The primary emphasis we have in this course is on trying to manage your parent-child reactions, or as Ali Donashi talks about it, primary is the parent well, infill is the child well. That's the new definition that the frac hit think tank a couple months ago came up with to try and minimize confusion. But want to try and avoid EUR losses. The big thing in there is not so much what happens to the parent, but what happens to the child well when you've created a pressure sink out there. And then that ends up having to limit the number of wellbores with the DSU if you can't control it, which is not good, because PUDs are definitely money in the bank, as we'll show the example financial-wise here. It's quite a significant hit. And then we talk about best practices to maximize productivity from the primary and infill wells, both. What's the best way to go? What options do you have? What are the pros and cons of the different options? And what do we recommend? We started working with refracs back in 2008. There was a lot of interest when the price, it seems like every time the price drops, everybody gets into refracs. And most of the time they don't really go too far. Usually there's more refrac conferences than there are refrac programs out there, but nonetheless, that's part of our business. They're competing with capital with new wells, which is tough sometimes. Initially, we talked about for vertical wells, basically what's in the ground to start with. Do your reservoir work, do your petrophysics, do your reservoir work, figure out what's the volume in there, And can you get that out economically? Can you use a better technique, a more appropriate completion technique to get it out, or where's the remaining reserves? Where are the remaining reserves? But and then as soon as horizontals took off, most of the interest level moved away from refracts because there really weren't any horizontal refracts to start with. And then everybody was focusing on holding acreage with new primary wells, because that was the big push. You spend $50,000 an acre for your acreage, you want to make sure you hold it. And that's not pad development. That's just getting one well in the ground there and making it work. So, as we started moving along in the horizontal world, though, people started realizing that your earlier generation frac treatments are leaving a lot of hydrocarbons in the ground. The case in point, which is great. I mean, it surprised me. It took 10 years for people to come up with this idea. But one operator in the Eagle Ford put a monitoring well 70 feet away from a Gen 1 frac well, and only 7.5 feet of that 50-foot cluster spacing was drained. 85% was undrained. So you didn't touch it. And we've known this for a while, but knowing something and actually putting it into practice in the field seems to be, there's somewhat of a disconnect there within the industry, because it takes 100 days for a gas molecule to go 1 meter at 100 nanodarcy rock. And in other words, if you don't crack the rock and break it, it doesn't produce. So, I mean, putting clusters 50 feet apart and expecting the oil and gas to get to you is just not realistic. You've got to be in the fracture swarm with you got to basically stimulate the entire interval. That's why you're seeing more and more operators go to shorter spacing. I think the closest I've seen so far is three clusters per pipe joint now, which has become popular in a lot of areas in the softer rocks. But they're not any refrac programs really didn't come into vogue then until we got into the infill development stuff. During the primary well development, really didn't see that much of an interest in refracs. Here's the well from South Texas. Again, 7.5 feet of lateral drainage was the only place they saw pressure depletion. They ran fiber optic pressures in the monitor well on top, and basically the monitor well down here, the producing well up here. It's a Gen 1, and it was a borate, so it was slick water. You might get a little more of a complex fracture system with that. Possibly more of an off balance type, as Ali talks about. Where you've got little splinters coming off, but not really that much. You probably won't expect too much width out of this, than much more than this. Maybe 2x with a slick water frac, or something people need to look at. So why they're becoming more important? Well, here's your distribution. Back in 2008, there were virtually no infill wells in the Eagle Ford. This is for the Eagle Ford specific, and really not too many until the end of 2010. And then people started going to pad development as they got their acreage locked down. It crossed over in 2014, and now the majority of the wells are child wells or infill wells. And the key issue there is, what do you do about the parent when you start the child development? So these FDIs, or frac hits, is becoming a real concern out there. And initially, people would notice that, well, you frac a well in the Eagle Ford, or frac a child well with a parent well offsetting, you kill the parent well, and then you got to go in and clean it out with coil and you put it back on production. And sometimes it came back, sometimes it didn't. Some areas, like in the Bakken, you actually get positive fractured FDIs. I mean, you can actually see production go up in some of the more higher modulus rock. But at any rate, your production histories were established on these child wells. Started realizing recovery factors are lower than what they should be based on the oil in place and the offset recovery factors, when you consider the frac vintage. And this is what kind of masked this whole thing to start with, is because, completions were constantly evolving and constantly improving at the time. You're basically your Gen 1 frac study, and this is Wolfcamp, where we did most of our work. Gen 1 fracs, typically about 8% recovery factor. Gen 2, and these proppant loadings are somewhat approximate. There's a range in here, and the thing about it is, as the proppant loading increased, people started bringing the clusters closer together too. So I think that the increase in production is just as much a function of bringing the clusters close together when you think about that Eagle Ford example, versus having the higher proppant volumes. Everybody says you put more proppant in the ground, you're going to get more hydrocarbons out of a wet shale well, and I don't dispute that, but I also think they need to consider that, with real wide cluster spacing, the average cluster spacing for the Eagle Ford in 2010 was 72 feet. When you're only draining 7, that's a pretty big disconnect between what's actually being drained and what's in there. And again, people thought the matrix drained. It doesn't. That's why the oil shale type stuff, the liquids rich shales, didn't take off for a while because people thought the rock was too tight to move oil. Heck, it's too tight to move gas too. So I mean, but that didn't register for some reason. The industry as a whole. Anyway, and I was one of those thinking that. So I can't blame anybody. And then Gen 3, we're looking around 14%. So if you could actually have a child well that performs the same as a parent well, and you think, okay, it's okay. Well, no, it's not okay, because the parent well only had 8% recovery factor, and you should be getting 14%. So that's what kind of kept things from being red flags were delayed on that. The anxiety levels going up. This is kind of an interesting thing. This infieldthinking.com. It's kind of a neat little website to get into. I got on it. This Brendan Elliott at Devon showed us this at the LA conference, and it's interesting. It's like looking through investor relations correspondence, press releases from operators. The frac hit fear index is what they call it. If they've seen a real big around first quarter of 2017, all of a sudden everybody started realizing, Houston, we got a problem. And the reason it took that long, because remember, 2014 was when you started having more child wells than parent wells. It took that long to realize from the production that you really weren't, you were having a problem. You didn't realize you had a problem because it was masked by the improvements that were being made in the completions at the time. I think, at least my theory is. And what's causing this? Well, basically, you're creating a pressure sink with the parent well when you produce it. And if your stresses are basically the same on both sides of your child well, if you have virgin stresses, it's a first well. Of course, it wouldn't be a child well anymore. But if you just have a well out in the middle of nowhere, you should have a symmetric fracture, granted, given that there's no other geologic issues or whatever, faults and the like. But if you have some depletion in one direction, and it doesn't have to be very much. This is what one of the biggest misunderstandings is it just has to be lower than the other side to get it going that way. It doesn't have to be, 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 300 pounds. You could probably, have less with higher pressures, but any kind of depletion is going to give that child well frac a path of least resistance. And what you're looking at here on this plot from this is the GTI Wolfcamp study. That green area is undrained rock. It's basically not being fracked because the parent well was off to the right there, to the east. The lost reserves are over in that little green blocks there. And they're showing, when they look at the details on this, and again, you got to normalize this for the current recovery factors too, you're looking at about 30 to 40% reduction in your EURs. So that's the problem. And as we'll show you, that really refracts are probably the ideal way to fix that problem, better than the other options. What are your opportunities? Well, first of all, and this is all Brendan Elliott's presentation from the LA conference, and it was also in JPT, so I cite him. It's very good work. Base case, do nothing, 20 to 40% degradation. You're going to have to clean out your parent well because it's going to be full of sand and junk. Small preload will avoid having to clean out the parent well, which is okay. From that perspective, you can save a coil run, but you're still going to get the same underperformance. And then a large preload, basically you're still looking at underperformance. Look, you're going from 20 to 40% to 15 to 35%. And that's what, large preload, I'm thinking 10, 20, 30,000, 40,000 barrels I've seen people do. You still have lower pressure in the child well or in the parent well than you do in the child well. So it's going to go that direction, even if you charge it to 90% of your pore pressure, So ideally, and the fourth option there is to completely recharge it. So you've got to basically replace every barrel that came out of there. I mean, if you produce 300,000 barrels of oil and 300,000 barrels of water, you got to put a 600,000 barrel frac in there. We got one Wolfcamp operator next month is going to be going out there and putting a 500,000 barrel preload on their well, and with fiber optics and everything, just to kind of see what's going on. That's kind of exciting to see what goes on. And theoretically, your full recharge should work to protect the child from asymmetric fracs, and also to keep the parent from getting bashed. But what it really does, and while it doesn't really damage the rock, which was kind of surprising to me, Ali Donahue quoted some references in his latest work that talks about rate transient analysis on recharge wells that were done with large preloads, and the preloads don't seem to affect the performance that much. I mean, assuming it's I don't know about gas wells. I mean, oil wells, you shouldn't see that much of an impact. So it's but the refracs though offer a couple things. They while you don't damage the well with the preload, you don't increase the production either. So with a refrac, you can go in and do both. You increase the production on the parent well, and then you protect the child well from damage. And then you just do zipper fracs on the rest of your child wells, and everything's good. You should see no degradation in performance. on those. So anyway, that's the ideal situation. And we'll show you on coming up in the Wolf Camp. We did a paper at the Refrac conference 2 years ago where we talked about the potential for refracs in the Wolf Camp. Of the ones that would have been refrac, the ones that weren't candidates, we didn't conclude, but the ones that were candidates, we averaged about a $3 million PV10. Now, that's compared to a $10 million PV10 on a 600,000 barrel well. It's not the same as you're going to see from a new well, but it's you're not going to go broke with that either. So, at any rate, and then also the bigger benefit is not really the $3 million that you save on the parent, that you increase the production on the parent well. It's the child well that you save. You save 40% of the reserves on that. So, and this is what the results are from the mitigation options. Again, the red is lost reserves. Theoretically, you can recharge the parent to 100% of the original pore pressure. And another complication with that is that you're looking at 400 to 500 perfs sometimes in the well. You've got to get the fluid into there. You've got to not only replace the fluid that came out of the well, you got to put it back where it came from. If you've got big gaps, you're probably going to have a number of stages that are effective, but then you're also going to have some ineffective stages. You may not be able to divert the entire fluid into the old depleted pore pressures. So that's where the refrac comes in. The refrac, basically does it and takes care of all that. Plus, it also gives you a positive PV10 on your well. So DSU levels where the problems are occurring, it's basically you're not seeing problems with the individual wells so much as you are as a whole. And we asked this question earlier. I was visiting with some operators yesterday. They're talking about they're not valuing an acquisition with 8 slots. They're valuing with 6 slots because they're saying they're seeing production problems. Well, there's also, saw this thing about the question about the refracs. The response from this group is very similar to what we're seeing from the community as a whole, that people just aren't doing refracs on shale wells. They're just very, very few operators are doing them. So if you don't protect the parent and you bash the child, you're going to see subnormal results in there. And then case in point is in the Permian, there was a big study done with reservoir simulation and history matching in the university lands area, which had a tremendous amount of information and data. They had all the data you want to need because operators have to report everything on those wells to university lands. So they had full data sets on these. And rate transient analysis suggests you're only looking at about 440 foot of drainage width. And if 8 wells per DSU, that's 660. So, you really shouldn't have to, go from 8 to 6 if you're doing this right. And you're seeing from the initial questions in there, if people aren't refracking, you're going to have to go to 6 wells. So that's what we're looking at there. So, the refrac on the primary well and then zipper frac for the infill wells. And again, you don't want to have a delay on your infill wells either because you're going to run into the same problem again. So, you pretty much got to, drill the pattern and then refrac the parent first and then go in and zipper frac the rest of your wells. And that's what a lot of operators are doing now. Here's your economic benefit, but the average refrac itself in the Wolf Camp, about $3 million. The infill loss, basically, and it's 40% EUR loss, but then that's not, it's somewhat related to your total dollars because some of that's covering the cost. But $6.8 million is what you're going to save by refracking that parent well, by having the child well able to get a good frac off on it. But now if you take it next level, if you're not doing the refracs, the economic benefit's significant there because you're looking at about $11.1 million. This is a 600,000 barrel well, liquid well, with GOR of 1081 with NYMEX strip, and with with typical well costs that you have out there. So overall, within a DSU per bench, now I've got some clients that are doing 3 and 4 benches in the Permian. Per bench, your total DSU benefits over $30 million. So it's something to think about, And if you do do nothing, you're going to lose that entire amount. You do the preload, you're going to lose that entire amount unless you do a full volume preload. But even then, if you do the full volume preload, you don't get the $3 million benefit from the refrac. You're doing well just to keep what you had after putting 500,000 barrels in the thing. At any rate, but that's what we're looking at the larger scale. Here's a flow chart where we recommend, number one, and whether you refrac a well or not, is basically what this is. The parent well, is it a parent well? Then yes, it's a refrac candidate. If you're going to offset it with child wells or with infill wells, then you need to refrac it. At that point, you look at your options there, okay? But if it's not a parent well, then you start with the basic refrac flow chart, recovery factor analysis. what was in the ground to start with using an integrated reservoir study, with petrophysics and reservoir engineering and geology. Is the oil in place, volume economic with the proposed refrac completion? Then you're back to where you were with the parent well. So your refrac options you look at, the three options that we look at most often that come up: expandables, which is the most efficient, very cost effective. You're looking at on a 5,000-foot lateral, the difference between an expandable inside of 5.5 and a 3.5 cemented liner is about a $500,000 economic benefit to the expandable, because you get more rate, you can get longer stages using extreme limited entry and the like. The random results diverters, and unfortunately, that's what most people are using based on the poll that started out, and that's you're kind of rolling the dice on that. You're really rolling the dice. It's you feel lucky today, you might work, but I'm not a fan of Eastwood fracs. I like to kind of control things. But when you do go ahead and line this well, which we hopefully you'll do one way or the other, implement the refrac. Right now we're looking at, say, for Eagleford, 13.3 feet. Three shots per 3 clusters per pipe joint. Extreme limited entry, which means a 1,500-pound pressure drop across the perfs at the end of the frac, and that usually results in about a 2,500-pound initial number. The initial number from the papers was 2,000, but we're finding that to get the post-erosion number, you've got to increase that. And what that also does with that increase is it allows for the core pressure depletion. So you're going to have to frac into your old perfs and in the new rock. So if that stress difference is too much, you're going to end up with very low cluster efficiency. Well, by getting around, you can get around that with the extreme limited entry. That's going to help overcome that. You may still have some issues. It's severely depleted, but and we may see people starting to change the delta P's as a function of the level of depletion, because it would make sense that you need more diversion in the lower pressure zones to try and break down the higher pressure zones. And then once you're done, just do zipper frac your child wells. That's it. You go from there. Now, the other course there, the recovery factor analysis, if your OIP is not economic, if you don't have a decent NPV 10 on it, then it's not a refrac candidate. Move on to the next well. Now, hopefully that's straightforward. Recovery factors, basically what's in the ground versus what's coming out. Very, very simple. We've got a whole course on that. We teach on how to come up with that in organic shales. And, it's calibrated petrophysical model, good EUR data, individual well, you can't use commingled. If you're looking at offset wells, you can't use the allocated production. You have to have individual monthly production to make this work. But anyway, just your EUR divided by your oil in place or your gas in place, depending on whether you're oil and gas. Really simple. And again, that should be around 14%. Now, if your refrac is 7% recovery factor, pre-refrac, then basically your prize is a 7% number. 7% of whatever your OIP is what you should be able to get out of there. With a properly executed refrac using extreme limited entry, close cluster spacing, you should be seeing the 14% plus or minus recovery factors in there. So here's an example of petrophysical analysis. Your porosities over on the right here. You can see that the red dots are your core porosity. Basically, there's your density porosity. You can see the kerogen effect. We take the kerogen out. There's your X-ray diffraction in red, showing the tie of the V clay. Water saturation, we try to tie into your bulk volume irreducible from your bulk volume hydrocarbon versus porosity plot. And we have a whole course on this too, and we'll talk about this in the refrac course. But basically, you want to have good petrophysical numbers going in, good porosity numbers, good pay thickness numbers, and good saturation numbers. And then here's an example of an economic failure, but what happened here was that this is an Andrews County Wolfcamp well. You had about 80 feet of height between two big stress barriers. You got a nice big stress barrier here, nice big stress barrier down here, a good 6 to 8 foot thick limestone stringer. You can see it over here, over here, and that's where they landed it. Well, the bad news is, they only got 80 feet. Typically, you see about 200 feet of growth on these when it's unhindered. But good news is we matched the EUR pretty well. So it's fairly close agreement on that. So we controlled the height on that. And this area is kind of, there's a disconnect in this area between the OIP and the recovery factors for that reason. Yeah. Okay, I've mentioned extreme limited entry. The cemented liner versus expandable liner. Basically, for a 5,000-foot lateral, you can get about 85 barrels a minute. Again, we're looking at Eagleford here primarily. 85 barrels a minute with your expandable liner, 4.1 ID versus 65 with the 3.5. which allows you to put more clusters per stage. And if you fix your cluster length at 13.3, then you can get 188 feet per stage and 144 foot for the other. And that allows you to complete it in 27 stages versus 35. That's 8 stages that you're saving. And you look at the total cost savings between the additional costs. The expandable liners are 120,000 or so more than the cemented. So up front, it looks like you're saving money with the cemented. But at the end of the day, with the longer stages, basically the fewer stages and the time savings on that, it comes up to quite a significant difference in the other direction, where the expandable liners are definitely superior to the cemented liners. And both of these are superior to the diverter. Diverter is, we're not big diverter fans, unless you feel really lucky today. No. So what's the course going to talk about? What makes a good refrac candidate in both conventional and unconventional reservoirs? Look at the flow chart kind of spells that out, but we go through the individual details. How do you get the oil in place? How do you get a calibrated model? What's going on with it? Is the poor performance of the candidate due to the initial frac, or is it the reservoir? You're not going to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear if there's no oil and gas there to start with. Your refrac's not going to help you. It's not going to generate oil and gas. So what's the optimum refrac strategy for primary or parent wells to avoid infill child EUR losses? And again, we can go into that in detail. What's the refrac well going to produce? We go into that in detail. That's where the recovery factor comes in. Where if you know your original recovery factor and you know what your oil in place is, you should be able to figure out what's left and what's going to come out. And overall, what's your best practices for both conventional and unconventional reservoirs? Because we have the course book is 300-400 pages long. It's pretty long, so we cover a lot of stuff in there, and we probably won't cover a lot of the unconventional stuff other than the basic stuff. But we do have everything's in there as available to be able to optimize both vertical and horizontal wells. And what information do you need? If you're not going to do the analysis, you're going to hire somebody to do it, or a service company to do the design and everything. What do you need to give them? What kind of information and analysis do you need to answer these questions? Okay, our course is coming up in August, 19th, 20th on the west side. And again, as Susan mentioned, we can do in-house sessions as well. And what we'd like to do is leave a little time at the end of the day and second day to have individual student case studies. If you've got a well that you want to work on, that you want to discuss with the group, hey, bring it. We'll get the LAS files from the wells nearby, any kind of specialty log data, production analysis. We'll work up your well. We'll work it up, and get you basically some ideas on where to go and some recommendations for, how to make it work. But and if you don't want to share it with the group, we can privately talk about it. But we definitely want to make sure when you leave the class that you can go out and do what you need to do with it. So you know everything you need to know to make this process work. Okay, and this kind of wraps it up. I'll turn it back to Susan here for follow up.
Great, thanks, Bob. So I wanted to remind all our listeners today that you are muted, so the best way for you to ask questions is to type your questions into the question box in your control panel, and we will read through those as they come in. Bob, you mentioned that the expandable liner option was the most efficient, but it was the least expensive of the 3 choices you gave us in the poll. We talked about expandable liners, cemented liners, and individual perfed versions. So why don't you think more people aren't using expandable liners?
Good question. Real good question. The initial cost, the sticker shock. I mean, you're looking at about 5,000 foot lateral. It's about $123,000 more to run it. The base cost of your 3.5 pipe is somewhere probably $20 a foot, plus or minus. And then your base cost of the expandable is like $60 to $70 a foot all in. So it's it does it quite a bit more up front, but and if you don't do extreme limited entry, it could be you might not be saving much money, because you got to be able to take advantage of the additional rate, and operators are starting to get on board with that fairly quickly. That seems to be working. I haven't seen any negatives on that yet anywhere. The XLE stuff, that Liberty was one of the pioneers of that up in the Bakken. But they've done quite a bit of work with that. I mean, Shell's doing a lot of work with it. Conoco's doing a lot of work with it. A lot of the big operators are doing work with that, EOG and the like. So a lot of the operators that are typically the technology, first movers are getting into it, and that's usually a good sign that it's going to stick.
Great. Next question, what is the longest successful run of an expandable liner in a perforated wellbore?
I think they're up to around 5,000 feet now with the one vendor we're working with. I'm not familiar with all the vendors that are out there. There's like 2 or 3 different vendors that are out there. But the one that we work with is I think, 5,000 feet, I believe. And we can get back to you on that if you give us some contact information. And you can, but that doesn't mean you can put 2 of them into 10,000 foot lateral. I mean, you're not limited to 5,000 total. You can put 2 of them there. You just got to make more than one run. That's all that means.
So you talked about a 30 to 40% reduction in EURs for the initial well or the parent well. Does that vary depending on how soon the infill wells are drilled after the parent well starts producing?
You think that from the literature, you've seen various recommendations from operators saying, well, if we produce a well this long, we can still do it. But by and large, if you look at just basic frac mechanics, if you have a 1,000-pound stress on one side and a 990-pound stress on the other side, it's going to go to the 990. It's going to follow the path of least resistance. So I don't, whether you, basically that question leads to, well, do you want to get 50% of your pore pressure back or 75% of your pore pressure back or 90%? I think you've got to get, unless I'm going to be proven wrong, but I'm pretty sure you got to restore 100% of that pore pressure to get your stress back to the initial state to avoid an asymmetric fracture. So I'm not sure there is a good time. I mean, if you haven't, if it's only produced a few barrels, that might not be out very far, but if it's been on production for a while, you got to be careful because it really doesn't. I don't think the degree of depletion is as important as the fact there is depletion.
So we noticed you were using some different terminology, frac-driven interactions instead of frac hits, and you were talking about primary and infill wells instead of parent-child wells. What's driving the change in all these terms?
About a few months back, Ali Donahue kind of headed up a group, a consortium of a lot of who's who in fracturing was in the meeting, and quite a few well-known names are in fracturing attended this conference in Houston. It was like a one-day conference, I believe, and that was one thing that came up during that conference. Is terminology confusing people, and the frac hit, sounds negative. It could be positive or it could be negative. It's not necessarily always negative. The child well, it basically was a consensus of that group, and there's people in there a lot smarter than I am that, that came up with it. We really need to get the terminology down to avoid any confusion, and also to avoid, issues with, if you're telling people you're damaging wells and stuff, sometimes that doesn't go over good outside the oil and gas business. So, we want to try and keep it, as accurate a description of what's going on as possible. So that came out of that consortium. I didn't make that up, but it sounds pretty reasonable.
More precision.
Yeah.
Next question, would refracs be more or less successful in a gas versus an oil play?
Good question. Yeah, I think you're going to have more success in oil than you will in gas. We do quite a bit of work. In fact, we operate some properties that are gas properties that we're going to be doing refracs on, but we're not going to touch them with water. We're not even going to drink water in our whiskey the night before we go out and frac the wells. I mean, depleted gas wells with sub-irreducible water saturation, you don't want to be messing with water. You really need to look at some kind of hydrocarbon-based fluid on that, which is what we're doing. But I haven't heard of a lot of real resounding successes in a lot of the gas plays too. I mean, like the Marcellus, I've heard relatively mixed results there sometimes. Like one of the major operators I talked to up there was completely against refracs because, I assume that because they had problems with it. So putting water back into initially sub-irreducible rock, now in the new perf's fine, but you might, in that case, if you're going to do a gas well, what would work is you probably have a hard time protecting it. You could refrac your gas well pretty effectively with water if you just put new perfs in there and didn't try to recharge the old ones. And even in the case of the new, and you could do the new and old together. I take that back. It's just you're not going to get much production out of the old. You're probably going to kill the old perfs, but the new perfs will be just like a new completion. And usually you'll have enough pressure there to get it cleaned up and avoid the capillary phase trapping problems.
So you talked about the pressure sink around the parent well. So how does that complicate the refracking process?
Well, basically, these fracs will. I mentioned earlier that your rate transient analysis shows 220 feet on your drainage, 240 feet plus or minus. Well, that's not where the frac goes initially. Frac hits have been observed, or fracture-driven interactions have been observed, several thousand feet away routinely. It's just what's actually producing is fairly close, because 90% of your flow area within a organic shale frac is going to be unpropped. So it's one of the reasons you can get away with overflushing. Basically, you got unpropped conductivity around the wellbore. You're not losing it like you do in conventional rock. But as soon as the frac will grow several, 2 to 3 times the radius of drainage, it'll physically go initially, and then all it has to do is get into that depletion field, and boom, it's gonna take the entire frac. There's no reason for a frac to go west if you've got a path of least resistance on the east. It's not going to go east and then build up pressure and go west. It's not like a net pressure diversion in a vertical well. It's going to go. Your frac's just basically lost. You're leaving the whole distal side of your reservoir unfracked where you don't have protection. So that's the phenomena there.
So you're advocating refracking the primary well before the infill wells are drilled. Is there still any logic to refracking both primary wells and infill wells later in the life of the field?
That gets more problematic. We're looking at that right now for some EOR applications down in Eagle Ford. We've got some operators that are looking at that to go in and try to refract. Because Gen 1 fracs for EOR, with 50-foot cluster spacing, you're probably leaving a lot on the table. If you want to go back in with, closer spacing and more stimulated reservoir volume before you do the EOR process. And we're working on that now. There's probably going to be a combination of the fracs and preloads, even though preloads are not optimum, but sometimes they may have a spot when you start dealing with the infill type stuff. Try to get some kind of barrier to keep the fracs from crossing over other fracs from multiple hits type of things, multiple well hits type of thing. But right now it's primarily just
can you talk more about how you?
I'm sorry.
Can you talk more about how you might design a refrac in preparation for an EOR project in unconventional reservoirs?
Sure. Just the standard best practices we talked about, the close cluster spacing, extreme limited entry. Those will give you what you need. But again, that's primarily focusing on the parent well. Going back into a fully developed pattern and doing that gets a little bit dicey. But I think it's doable, but it's something we haven't completely got our arms around on the best way to do it. The ideal situation is you have you have your parent well drilled already, and you're ready to do your child well. You've got an 8-well pattern. You drill your 7 child wells. Don't frack them yet. Then before you frack your first child well, frack the parent well, refrack the parent well, and then in your infill or child wells, you do zipper fracks on that. And that you should have minimal interference between any of the wells if you do that. Now, if you've got 2 parent wells, for instance, then it starts getting a little more complicated. But right now, the typical scenario is a single parent well with offsets is what we're primarily talking about here in this particular deal. And you could also have, you could have child wells on both sides of a parent too. You might have another operator with the lease next to you to the east. So it could affect. You could actually bash 2 child wells with that too, with that same deal with having the parent well sink there.
So you said that in some instances, 85% of the reservoir was untouched in the work that they had done in the university lands project. So is there something that needs to be done regarding the design of the original stimulation?
Yes, and that was not the university lands was a rate transient analysis for the 220 or so foot radius. The Eagle Ford test was a major operator down there that did that, and that's where your close cluster spacing. In fact, the operator that ran that test, we visited with them a couple of weeks ago, and they tried bringing clusters down to 7.5 feet spacing based on that, and it just got it didn't really make that much of a difference. So I think you can go a little bit wider. They're back to the 15-foot range now, 13, 15-foot range. But they tried perforating just based on that test. But I think one of the complicating factors on the test was it was a borate. They pumped a borate on the parent well, and you tend to get more planar fracs with the borates. With the slick water, you get more of a off balance type frac. So I think that with slick water, you probably get a lot more than 7.5 feet. Now, not a whole lot more, but you get more. So that the 15 feet seems to be working pretty well. And that's the number that they seem to be converging on, is around 15-foot cluster spacing.
And it sounds like you're recommending against the borate frac technique.
Not a whole lot of that going on right now. Yeah, I mean, I think slick water is pretty much taken over the industry. Okay. Slick water and 100 mesh, and even 40/70 is starting to become rare in some areas. And other areas we're doing micro proppant. In fact, on one project we're working on with the oil-based fracs, we're using fly ash as a proppant.
Okay. Another question: can you comment on refractoring fluid and how it should be different than the original frac fluid?
Exactly. Good. The last question is pretty much the same as this one. Yeah, I mean, I think your gel fluids are probably not in your best interest. Typically, I haven't seen too many areas now. This is for organic shales. I mean, if you're looking at conventional reservoirs, maybe like Bone Springs or something like that, you might be able to get away with something a little differently. And also, the close cluster spacing is not required there either. You don't have to worry about that. That's not as big of an issue with that. With the more matrix rock. You can spread your perfs out if you have actual matrix permeability. The 13.3 is for organic shale where you have no permeability in your matrix. So, and then slick water and small diameter proppants, I think, are pretty much the rule right now rather than the exception.
So, any other tips that you can share as far as best practices on selecting your completion or refracking style?
No, just that the flow chart's pretty comprehensive as far as just the basics of the steps involved on it. So, there's nuances involved with all that, but that's your basic flow would be on that. And it's really basically at the end of the day when you go out to do the refrac, there's absolutely no difference between a refrac and the new well frac. Other than the fact it's probably more important to do XLE on that with high pressure drop because you're going to have pressure differences between your clusters, but between your perfs clusters. We're also recommending one shot per cluster now. That came out of the LA conference last month, which makes perfect sense because then you can do a step down test and get your cluster efficiency directly. You don't have to guess at what clusters or what perfs within what clusters are helping you, which is kind of neat. Things like that are different. And we talk about all these best practices that everybody's doing. It's constantly moving. We have to change this course material about every other month. There's new stuff coming out all the time on this stuff. People are trying new stuff, and what works and what doesn't work, move on to something else. But yeah, it's definitely a exciting part of the business right now, dynamic part of the business.
It's great to see all the innovation. So that's the last of our questions. I want to thank our audience for attending today's webinar. Later this afternoon, you'll get a link to the recording of the webinar. You'll receive an evaluation form and a link to register for the course that Bob will be teaching on refrac candidate selection, execution, and performance evaluation for conventional and unconventional reservoirs. That's scheduled to be held in Houston on August 19th through 20th. And remember, this class has been refocused to include parent well protection as part of the emphasis of the course. So thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.